Okay, so after doing many videos over the past few weeks on the ongoing tensions between the United States and Venezuela and Iran, I've come to the conclusion that I think for now, at least for the next year, there probably won't be any wars with either of those countries. I think that in both those cases, tensions have begun to de-escalate. I'm still not exactly sure what these Brinksmanship exercises were supposed to achieve, particularly in the case of Iran, but as things stand right now, I don't think that the Trump administration as a whole is seeking war with either of these countries. So first, the case of Venezuela, which I think is the more obvious one because we haven't heard much news about Venezuela over the past few weeks. What I think happened with Venezuela was that Bolton essentially convinced Trump that he wouldn't have to ever go to war with Venezuela, but if he backed this Guaido guy, the military in Venezuela would switch sides, there'd be a coup, and then Trump would be on the right side of history because he backed this nice, Barack Obama-looking guy who rolled up his sleeves and was kind of had a pretty wife, and he was educated in the U.S., and so this would be an easy foreign policy victory for Trump. That, of course, didn't end up panning out, and then they kept escalating on things and threatening Maduro that, if you don't get out, bad things are going to happen, and sanctioning him. And this, of course, culminated in what was supposed to be a coup d'etat against the Maduro government, led by Guaido, with a bunch of his military supporters that he apparently had been working on trying to gain over the past couple months. And it turns out that all those guys, I guess, were double agents because according to Bolton and Rubio, there were a bunch of high-level guys in the Venezuelan military who were supposed to switch sides on that date, and they didn't. And so what ended up happening was Guaido had about 28 military defectors who were wearing these blue armbands, and that was about it. He didn't have any real force. And so the coup was really went out with a whimper rather than even a yelp, let alone a battle cry. And after that, it kind of seems to me that Trump has hung Guaido out to dry. I mean, Guaido's been begging for weeks just to get a meeting with some American officials. Guaido's folks were supposed to meet with the commander of Southcom in Miami. Southcom, of course, is one of the U.S. strategic commands and has jurisdiction, I guess you could say, as creepy as that sounds, over South America. And that meeting had been put off until ultimately yesterday morning it was canceled abruptly, which kind of made it look like the Guaido folks had egg on their face. But then it was announced, oh no, we're still going to have a meeting with the U.S., but it'll be with the State Department and the Pentagon in Washington. Now, some people are saying that the fact that Guaido's folks are meeting with the Pentagon is showing that the U.S. is still interested in some kind of military involvement. But at this point, I think that this was more of a courtesy than anything. The U.S. has not rushed to grant Guaido military assistance, and frankly, they haven't even talked about it that much recently. And I think perhaps moving the meeting from Miami to Washington shows that they're less interested in helping Guaido's folks militarily, because Guaido did have a meeting scheduled with the commander of Southcom, who is closer to any real operations that would actually occur in Venezuela. So therefore, by having him meet with folks in Washington, he's more meeting with the military bureaucracy and less with the actual commanders. Fundamentally, though, I think that Trump probably sees the Venezuela situation as stabilized, and he has no interest in doing anything in Venezuela that could set off a refugee crisis and send millions of people to the southern border. Trump wants to look like he's keeping illegals out of the country, not driving them into the country. A war in Venezuela, unlike, say, a war in the Middle East, would directly impact the daily lives of ordinary Americans who are in no way involved with the military. Now then, if there's probably not going to be a war with Venezuela, then let's look at Iran. Iran I've been covering extensively over the last couple weeks because there's been a lot going on with Iran, especially in the last week. The administration has been perhaps more bellicose in its rhetoric towards Iran than it ever was towards Maduro and Venezuela. We appeared to me to be much closer to a war with Iran in the last week than we were at any point with Maduro. The Trump administration drew a red line and essentially said that if Iran or its proxies, which is a very broad category then, does anything naughty and hurts any Americans, well, then we're going to end your country. Basically saying that if any Shiites really anywhere in the Middle East, because all Shiites are considered by the U.S. to be Iranian proxies, if any Shiite killed any Americans, well, then it's going to be Iran's fault. And since that time, there's been some things that they've tried to pin on Iran. 4 tankers got bombed but weren't actually sunk. And, of course, the Houthis, who have been at war with Saudi Arabia for many years, have been firing into Saudi Arabia. And there have been folks in the media trying to pin that on Iran, which is nonsense because the Houthis, regardless of this Iran tension, the Houthis have been fighting the Saudis for years because the Saudis invaded their country. Now, the last thing that perhaps could have been something serious was that somebody fired a rocket into the Green Zone, which is a very big area with a lot of embassies in Baghdad, and folks were trying to say that, oh, well, this was an attack targeting the U.S. Embassy. Well, it didn't really hit the U.S. Embassy. It hit an abandoned building. So they can't really say had it hit the U.S. Embassy, that might have been something that it could use to justify war with Iran. But unfortunately for John Bolton, nobody died in that attack. It didn't hit anyone, and it was just sort of a little stray shot. So in sum, Iran really hasn't done anything egregious enough to warrant going to war with them based on the standard that the Trump administration set. Iran really hasn't crossed their red line, even if you're trying to be very generous to the Trump administration. Now, the next point is that Trump and Pompeo, I think, see that a war with Iran could be very bad for them politically. Trump is someone who, throughout his life, or at least in the last few years, has been somewhat of an opponent of U.S. wars in the Middle East, even when other people were not. I think he sees that the Iraq and the Afghanistan war were bad PR cases for the Bush administration. They made Bush look feckless, and it's why he's remembered in not a very positive light by a lot of people. Trump in no way wants to repeat the mistakes of George W. Bush. He doesn't want to be considered the next George W. Bush. And along those same lines, he also is worried that if he gets into a war now, that a year and a half from now, when he's going into re-election, if the war is not going well, then he probably is going to lose. From Trump's perspective, it probably would only make sense to get into a war with Iran maybe next summer, so that then you have the patriotic spirit of everyone saying, okay, yeah, let's go beat these people up by the time the election rolls around, but then you don't have enough time of actually being at war for things to turn against you like they did in Iraq. And Trump is not the only stakeholder who is influencing this administration. There's also Mike Pompeo, who is the Secretary of State. Now, Mike Pompeo, from what I've heard, is looking to run for president at some point in the future. And therefore, if he's going to run as a former Secretary of State, he doesn't want to have any major foreign policy black eyes on his record, or else he probably will be doomed in his run for president. So therefore, considering that a war with Iran likely will not go well for the U.S. in the long term, Pompeo is incentivized to avoid a war with Iran so as to keep from besmirching his record and harming his political prospects. That means then that the only person with a lot of sway in the administration who is virulently pro-war would be John Bolton. Bolton has never really been elected to anything, so he doesn't care that much about politics. He cares about what he thinks is right, and I tend to think that his priorities and his values are not at all in line with my own, but I can admit that he does seem to say what he believes. And so John Bolton, in his heart of hearts, thinks that the best thing for the U.S. Would be to take out the current government in Iran. And he has a lot of sway over the administration as the National Security Advisor, but I don't think he has enough to really pull this off by himself when Trump and Pompeo really don't have that much interest in it. I think that he would need a pretty big justification, say a Iranian attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, for example, a successful one, in order to justify any kind of war. And so I think that's why we're seeing the administration come out today and start to de-escalate things with Iran. The Defense Secretary, Patrick Shanahan, who's a former Boeing executive, he came out and said that they don't expect any immediate threats from Iran. He doesn't think that Iran is posing any immediate threat on Americans in the Middle East. He doesn't think that there's Shiite militias who are about to, target the embassy or an American base somewhere. None of that. Shanahan says that the administration's troop movements, the Carrier Strike Group, the B-52 bombers that were moved all to the Persian Gulf region, that these have successfully deterred Iran and that nothing bad is going to happen now. And so this is kind of the Trump administration's way of declaring victory and getting out before the war has even begun. They can now say, hey, we tried this Brinksmanship strategy, we got real hawkish and threatened Iran with war, and they backed down, so then we didn't have to go to war. This they're going to try and spin this as a victory, and it very well may be, because again, we don't really have any of the intelligence, we don't know to what extent any of this. I mean, the whole situation could have been BS, and they just decided not to go through with it. But anyway, as of today, it seems like the administration is not going to go to war with Venezuela or Iran, based on what they're telling us. That's the way things look to me. I may be dead wrong. The bombs may start falling in either Caracas or Tehran tomorrow. But as of today, it is my opinion that we're pretty safe for about the next year. I think I would start looking when we get closer to the election. If Trump's not doing that well, he may want to boost in approval ratings, and then a war may start to make sense. But until then, we'll just have to wait and see. So if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.